Eleanor Voss fed Caleb Hargrove's promise into the depot stove herself. Letter, envelope, and all 8 pages of careful lies. Then stood straight-backed while it burned, and watched every woman on that platform step away from her like scandal was something you could catch. She had 11 cents in her coat pocket, no husband coming, and a station master already jingling his closing keys. She was 29 years old and had just destroyed the last thing connecting her to any future she had planned. She did not cry. She had learned long ago that tears cost more than she could afford. Before we go any further, if this story already has your heart, please take a moment to like this video and leave a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to know how far Eleanor's story has traveled. And if you haven't subscribed yet, hit that button now so you don't miss a single chapter of what happens next. Now, let's go back to Coldwater, Montana, 1882, and find out what happens to a woman the world decided to forget. The station master's name was Harold Briggs, and he had the particular talent of delivering bad news with the expression of a man who had already moved on from caring about it. "Miss, the 7:15 was the last eastbound until Thursday." He didn't look up from his logbook. "You'll want to make arrangements." Eleanor stood at the window of the Coldwater Depot and kept her eyes on the tracks. "I'm aware of the schedule, Mr. Briggs." "Then you're aware I need to lock up." "I am aware of that as well." He finally looked at her then, the way men looked at women who were causing inconvenience by existing in the wrong circumstances. His gaze traveled from her traveling coat, good wool, carefully maintained, 2 years out of fashion, to the single carpet bag on the bench beside her, to the absence of any man standing anywhere nearby. "You got somewhere to go, miss?" "I am working on that." "Because the hotel—" "I know where the hotel is." Eleanor turned from the window. She kept her voice level. She had spent 6 years as a bookkeeper for the Caldwell Land Company in Cincinnati, and she had learned in that time that a woman who raised her voice in any professional dispute had already lost it. "I will be out of your depot within the hour, Mr. Briggs. You have my word." He left her alone, which was the most she could ask from anyone today. She sat down on the bench and opened her coin purse and counted what was there, though she already knew the number. 11 cents. She had paid her last $1.50 to the conductor for the final leg from Billings, trusting that Caleb Hargrove's letter had been honest about meeting her, about the arrangement, about the promise of a fresh start managing the books for his cattle operation. 8 months of correspondence. She had been careful. She had asked the right questions, cross-referenced what he told her against what she could verify, because she had learned the hard way what happened when a woman trusted a man's word without verifying the ledger behind it. And still she had ended up here, in a Montana depot, with 11 cents and the smoke from his burned letters still faintly on her fingers. A woman's voice came from the far end of the platform, carrying the particular brightness of someone who wanted to be overheard. "That's her." A pause. "The one Hargrove sent for and didn't bother to collect." Another voice, lower, with a practiced sympathy that meant no sympathy at all. "Poor thing." "Poor thing nothing. A woman her age answering one of those advertisements?" A short laugh. She knew what she was doing. Eleanor did not turn around. She picked up her carpetbag, moved it to her other side, and sat with her back perfectly straight, the way her mother had taught her when she was 12 years old, and the foreman's wife had said something cruel at the church social. "You don't answer them, Eleanor. You make them irrelevant." She was making them irrelevant when the door from the freight office opened. She heard him before she saw him, the deliberate pace of someone who moved through spaces without announcing himself, the kind of walk that belonged to a man who had spent years approaching situations quietly and assessing them before acting. She had worked alongside Pinkerton men during her time at Caldwell Land, and they all moved like that, like the floor was telling them something. He was somewhere in his late 30s, dark-haired with gray coming in at the temples, wearing a work coat with real use on it rather than the performance of use. The scar through his left eyebrow was old. His eyes, when they crossed the platform and landed on her, were brown and still and completely without the pity she had been bracing herself against all afternoon. He looked at her the way a man looks at a situation he is calculating. He touched the brim of his hat. "Ma'am?" Then he kept walking toward the exit. Harold Briggs appeared again, keys in hand, the apology already assembled on his face. "Miss, I truly am sorry, but he's not coming." Eleanor said it flat and clean, the way you read a number off a balance sheet when the number is bad. No inflection, just the fact. "Caleb Hargrove is not coming, and I am fully aware of my circumstances. You may lock your depot." The man with the gray-streaked hair had stopped at the door. She felt it before she saw it, that particular quality of stillness that meant someone had made a decision. "Pardon the intrusion, ma'am." His voice was quiet and unhurried. He turned back toward her without any of the performance of a man doing a good deed. "Daniel Rourke. I run the Rourke cattle operation, about 7 miles north of town." He stopped at a respectful distance. "I couldn't help but overhear." "Most people in this depot could not help but overhear." Eleanor looked at him directly. "That seems to be the nature of train stations." Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile. More like a man recalibrating. "Fair enough." He glanced once at Harold Briggs, who took the hint and retreated toward his office with the keys. Then he looked back at her. "I have a problem I've been trying to solve for about 4 months. My land records are a disaster. My last bookkeeper left for Denver in July and took most of his system with him, which means my tax filings for the year are wrong. My boundary surveys haven't been properly cross-referenced, and I have a land company out of Chicago telling me I owe them acreage that I'm fairly certain I don't." He paused. "Are you the Eleanor Voss who worked the accounts for Caldwell Land Company in Cincinnati?" Eleanor went very still. "How do you know that name?" "I was Pinkerton for 8 years. I make it my business to know things." He said it without pride, just the same flat honesty he'd used for everything else. "Caldwell Land's fraud case was federal. Your name was in the depositions as a witness for the prosecution. You identified the falsified entries." He held her gaze. "That's not the record of a woman who can't read a land document." The 2 women at the far end of the platform had gone quiet. Eleanor was quiet too, for a moment, measuring him the way she measured everything. Looking for the inconsistency, the angle, the place where the number didn't balance. "You came here to pick up freight," she said, "not to hire a bookkeeper." "I came here to pick up a replacement pump head and 200 feet of wire fencing. Finding someone who can actually read a survey plat is what you'd call an unexpected opportunity." He didn't push, he just waited, and the waiting had the quality of a man who genuinely didn't need her to say yes, which was more convincing than any argument he could have made. "What are the terms?" she asked. "Room and board in the main house, separate quarters, $40 a month, same rate I paid the last man. Access to every document on the property. You work the records, I work the cattle, and neither of us pretends the other's job is simple." He picked up his hat from where he'd set it on the bench. "If you decide in a week it's not for you, I'll pay your stage fare to Billings. No obligations beyond honest work." Eleanor thought about the 11 cents. She thought about Cincinnati, about the way her name had sounded in a courtroom when the Caldwell attorneys tried to make witness and accomplice mean the same thing. She thought about Caleb Hargrove's ashes in the depot stove. Her mother's voice, which had been quiet for 3 years now. Sometimes the only choice worth making is which risk you take on your own terms. "I'll need to see the original survey plats," she said. "Not copies, originals, with the county recording stamps. If your records are as disordered as you say, I'll know within 2 days whether the land company's claim has any legitimate basis." "They're in my office." "Then we should leave before full dark." Eleanor stood, picked up her carpetbag, and looked at him steadily. "I want it understood, Mr. Rourke, that I am accepting employment. Nothing beyond that."
"That's all I'm offering, Miss Voss."
She walked past the 2 women at the far end of the platform without looking at them once. The wagon was solid and practical, the kind of equipment bought to last rather than to impress. 2 good horses. A kerosene lantern hung ready at the driver's bench. Eleanor climbed up without assistance, which she could see surprised him slightly, and settled her carpetbag at her feet. He swung up on the other side and gathered the reins, and they rolled out of Coldwater as the last light went amber over the Montana hills. "The land company," Eleanor said, once the town was behind them. "What's the name?" "Whitmore and Associates. Gerald Whitmore, out of Chicago." Daniel guided the horses onto the northern road without looking at her. "He's been buying up ranch land across 3 counties since the railroad announced the Northern Pacific extension. Mostly through tax auctions. Finds properties with back taxes, buys the debt, takes the land." "Finds them or creates them?" He glanced at her sideways. "What makes you ask it that way?" "Because that's how it was done in Cincinnati." She kept her voice even. "Caldwell Land didn't just wait for properties to have tax problems. They manufactured the problems. Altered the county records, created false assessments, then bought the auctions they'd engineered." She looked at the darkening hills. "When a land company is moving that fast across that much territory, it's rarely because they got lucky. It's because they built the luck themselves." The silence that followed was the kind that meant a man was thinking carefully about what he'd just heard. "My survey shows clear title to 4,800 acres, Daniel said. "The east boundary runs to Powder Creek. Whitmore's attorneys filed a claim last month, saying the original 1874 survey was in error, and my eastern 800 acres actually belong to a parcel he purchased in August." He paused. "The attorney who handled my original purchase died 2 years ago. His records are with the county clerk, but the clerk's office has had 3 different men in it since then, and nobody can seem to locate the original plat." Eleanor heard the shape of it immediately. The way a fraudulent account always had a shape, a pattern of convenient absences and misdirected attention. "Who surveyed the original parcel?" "Man named Thomas Garrett, out of Helena." "Is he still practicing?" "Last I heard." "Then the original survey is in the state records office in Helena, regardless of what's missing at the county level." She turned to look at him directly. "That's where they can't touch it, Mr. Rourke. County records can be lost or altered by anyone with access and motive. State records require a different level of intervention." She paused. "Did Whitmore's attorneys specifically reference the county plat in their filing?" "They did. And not the state record." "Not that I saw." Eleanor faced forward again. The first stars were coming out over the northern range, cleaner and closer than anything she had seen in Cincinnati. "Then either they don't know the state copy exists," she said, "or they know it exists and are hoping you don't." Daniel Rourke was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice had shifted slightly. Not warmer exactly, but more direct. The way a man speaks when he's stopped deciding whether to trust someone, and has decided. "You figured that out from one conversation." "I figured it out from a pattern I've seen before." She didn't let pride into her voice. Pride had cost her things. "It may be nothing. Your records may be exactly what they appear, and Whitmore may have a legitimate claim I haven't seen yet. I won't know until I've read the documents." "Fair enough." He clicked to the horses, setting them into a steadier pace as the road climbed. "Can I ask you something, Miss Voss?" You can ask,
Why did you come west?
not the answer from the advertisement, the real one. She had prepared for this question. She had a composed version of the answer, the one that was true enough to pass and didn't require her to hand a stranger anything he could use against her. But there was something about the plain directness of the way he asked it, no manipulation in it, no angle she could detect, that made the composed version feel dishonest in a way she didn't want to start with. I made a mistake in Cincinnati, she said. Not the kind the Caldwell attorneys claimed, but a mistake nonetheless. I trusted a man's word without verifying what was behind it, and when the fraud came apart, my name was close enough to the wreckage that it took 18 months to clear. She looked at the dark road ahead. I was cleared, completely and formally. It didn't matter. In a city that size, a woman's reputation doesn't recover from proximity to scandal the way a man's does.
I had my skills and nowhere to use them, so when Hargrove's advertisement appeared, I thought... She stopped. You thought starting over somewhere nobody knew the story was worth the risk, Daniel said. Yes. I understand that. He said it like he meant it, not like he was offering comfort. I left Pinkerton for similar reasons. Knew the truth of a situation, couldn't act on it because the man at the center of it had more money than my agency wanted to fight. Walked away rather than put my name on a report I knew was compromised. He paused. Bought this land with what I'd saved, which wasn't enough, so I worked twice as hard to make it enough. Takes a while before you stop looking over your shoulder. Does it stop? Mostly. A beat. On good days. The lights of the ranch came up in the distance, and Eleanor leaned forward slightly without meaning to. She had imagined a modest operation, a working ranch, nothing beyond function. What appeared in the lantern-lit dark was larger than she'd expected. A main house with a wide porch, outbuildings in good repair, a bunkhouse with smoke rising from the chimney, corrals where horses moved in the darkness. It's substantial, she said. Took 15 years. He guided the wagon toward the main house. The first 4 years, I slept in the barn. A woman appeared on the porch before they had fully stopped. 60s, broad-shouldered, with the expression of someone who had been managing other people's business long enough to have no patience left for drama. That's Ruth Sampson, Daniel said quietly. She runs the house. Has done since I built it. Don't let her manner alarm you. Mr. Rourke. Ruth Sampson came down the porch steps, looked at Eleanor with the direct assessment of a woman who had seen enough of life to skip the polite version of sizing someone up, and said, You're the bookkeeper. I am, Eleanor said. Can you cook? Adequately. Good enough. The men are terrible at it, and Daniel won't admit it. She took Eleanor's carpet bag from the wagon bed before Eleanor could reach it. You'll have the room off the study. It has its own entrance. Supper's been kept warm. She looked at Daniel. Pete found the east fence cut again. 3rd time this month. Daniel's expression didn't change much, but something tightened behind his eyes. Where? 1/4 mile south of the creek crossing. Miles rode the line this afternoon. Ruth carried Eleanor's bag toward the house. He thinks it's deliberate. So do I. Daniel was already down from the wagon. He looked at Eleanor briefly. Ruth will get you settled. I need to speak with Miles. He paused, and for a moment she could see the former Pinkerton man underneath the rancher. The way he was already assembling information, looking for the pattern. Miss Voss, if you do find anything in those records in the next few days, I'll tell you immediately. She held his gaze. Whatever I find. He nodded once and moved toward the bunkhouse with the quiet efficiency of someone who had stopped wasting motion a long time ago. Ruth Sampson set Eleanor's bag inside the room off the study and lit the oil lamp on the desk without being asked. The room was small and clean and completely functional. A narrow bed, a washstand, a writing table with a good chair. On the desk,
Stacked in 3 uneven piles were ledger books, survey maps, county filing receipts, and a leather folder that Eleanor recognized immediately as the kind used by land attorneys. She stood in the doorway and looked at those piles. "They've been like that since July," Ruth said from behind her, "when the last man left." "He left in a hurry," Eleanor said. The disorder had the look of abandonment rather than negligence. Papers pulled out and not replaced, folders half opened. "What do you know about why he went?" Ruth was quiet for a beat too long. "He was offered a position in Denver. Better wages," he said.
"Who offered it?" Another pause. "I don't know that he ever said." Eleanor looked at the leather folder on top of the nearest pile. It had a stamp on the front she recognized, a notary seal from the Whitmore and Associates letterhead. She didn't touch it yet. She stood in the doorway of that room and understood, with the particular clarity that came from having seen this before, in a different city, with different names and the same essential shape, that she had not arrived at Daniel Rourke's ranch by accident. She had arrived exactly where her skills were needed. Whether that was good fortune or someone else's design, she could not yet say. "Supper," Ruth said, and her voice had shifted slightly. Not softer, but different. The manner of a woman who has measured someone and reached a preliminary conclusion. "And then sleep, Miss Voss. The records will still be there in the morning." Eleanor picked up the Whitmore folder, set it carefully on top of the stack where she could find it first thing, and followed Ruth Sampson to the kitchen. At the long table, 4 ranch hands looked up from their plates with the wariness of men who had learned not to get attached to people who passed through. A young one, barely 20, with straw-colored hair and an open face, stood halfway up from his chair without deciding to. "Pete Calloway," Ruth said, by way of introduction. "Sit down, Pete." He sat, coloring. Miss Voss is fine." Eleanor sat at the end of the table, accepted the plate Ruth set in front of her, and picked up her fork. "Thank you." The men ate. Eleanor ate. Nobody spoke for a while, which was its own kind of courtesy. Then Pete Calloway said, without quite looking at her, "You really a bookkeeper?" "I am." "Like, you can read the survey maps and the tax records and all that?" "That's correct." He looked at his plate. Something in his young face was doing the calculation of whether to say the next thing. He said it. "Good. Because I've been worried about those records since Marcus left, and I don't think it was just Denver that pulled him away." He glanced at the empty chair at the head of the table, where Daniel should have been sitting. "I think somebody paid him to go." The table went quiet. Eleanor looked at the young man steadily. "What makes you think that?" "Because 2 days before he left, a man in a city suit rode up to the gate asking for him specifically. Not for Mr. Rourke, for Marcus, by name." Pete Calloway met her eyes, and she could see he'd been carrying this for a while. "And when Marcus came back from talking to him, he packed that same night." Eleanor set down her fork. She thought about the Whitmore folder on the desk in the room off the study. She thought about the cut fence line and the missing county plat, and the convenient departure of the man who had been keeping the records. She thought about Cincinnati, and about a different desk in a different city, and about how fraud always looked the same underneath, regardless of what state you were standing in when you found it. "Pete," she said quietly, "tell me everything you remember about the man in the city suit." Pete Calloway wrapped both hands around his coffee cup and stared at the table like the memory was something physical he was trying to pick up. "He was heavy," he said finally. "Not fat like a man who doesn't work, but heavy like a man who's been comfortable a long time and doesn't think about it. Wore a suit that cost more than my wages for a year. Had rings on 2 fingers, one with a red stone, one plain gold." He paused. "His boots were city boots, clean.
which means he came by wagon, not on horseback. Nobody rides clean boots into ranch country.
Did you hear any of what he said to Marcus? Some. I was fixing the gate latch about 30 feet off. Pete glanced around the table, and Eleanor could see the other men listening without pretending not to. He said Marcus's name to start, real familiar, like he knew him already. Then he said something about an opportunity in Denver, a position that suited his skills. Then his voice dropped, and I couldn't catch it. He set the cup down. But Marcus's face changed when the man stopped talking. Whatever the last part was, it wasn't about Denver. What did his face do? Pete thought about it. Went still, like when a horse smells something it doesn't like, but hasn't decided yet whether to bolt. He looked at Eleanor directly. Marcus wasn't a bad man, miss. I don't think he wanted to go. I think he decided he had to. Eleanor filed that away. A man who left reluctantly was a man who might talk, eventually, if the right circumstances arose. She noted it and let it sit. Did anyone else see the visitor? Get a name? An older man at the far end of the table, weathered face, gray mustache, the stillness of someone who'd spent decades reading weather and trouble with equal attention, said without looking up from his plate, "Miles Cutter, that'd be me." He finally raised his eyes. I saw him ride in. Saw the wagon he came in anyway. Had a company mark on the side. W and A in a circle. Fancy painted letters. Whitmore and Associates. Eleanor kept her expression neutral. Thank you, Mr. Cutter. It's just Miles. He went back to his plate. And you're welcome. She ate the rest of her supper without asking more questions, because she had enough to begin with, and because she had learned in Cincinnati that the fastest way to make people stop telling you things was to make them feel interrogated. She thanked Ruth for the meal, said goodnight to the table, and went back to the room off the study. She did not sleep for a long time. She sat at the writing desk with the Whitmore folder open in front of her and read it through twice in the lamplight. It was the formal filing, the claim against Daniel's eastern 800 acres, framed as a survey correction, signed by a land attorney named Prescott Helms out of Billings. The language was careful and precise, the kind of language that had been written by someone who knew exactly how to make a fraudulent claim look procedurally immaculate. She had read this language before. Different names, different state, same architecture. The filing referenced the county plat, specifically a revised county plat dated September of 1881, 7 years after Daniel's original purchase. She underlined that date with her fingernail, leaving a faint crease in the paper. A revised plat, 7 years later, introduced as the authoritative document over the original. The original, which was conveniently unavailable at the county level. She closed the folder, set it precisely on the corner of the desk, and finally lay down on the narrow bed without undressing. The lamp burned low. Outside, somewhere in the dark, she could hear the horses moving in the corral, and beneath that, the vast quiet of the Montana range. So different from the city sounds she'd slept under her whole life, that it felt almost like silence had a texture out here. She thought about Daniel Rourke riding back in from the cut fence line, and whether he'd found anything, and whether he was the kind of man who would tell her if he had. She thought she probably was going to find out. She was at the desk by 5:30 the following morning, before Ruth had the kitchen fire going, working by lamplight with the original ledgers open in front of her and the blank sheet of paper beside her hand, where she recorded dates, figures, and questions as she moved through the disorder Marcus had left behind. The work had its own rhythm, the way accounting always did when you let yourself fall into it. A kind of sustained attention that was almost peaceful, the numbers arranging themselves into patterns that told stories if you knew how to read them. She was deep into the tax payment records for 1879
when Daniel Rourke appeared in the study doorway at 6:30. He had come in from outside. She could smell the cold morning air on him and see it in the set of his shoulders. And he stood for a moment, looking at the organized stacks she'd already created from the chaos of the night before. "You've been at it since before dawn," he said. It wasn't a question. "I work well in the early hours." She didn't look up. "The fence." "Cut clean. Wire cutters, not breakage. Same spot as the last 2 times, which means someone knows our patrol pattern." He moved to the chair across the desk and sat down, folding his hands. "What have you found?" "Enough to have questions."
She set down her pen. "Your tax payments are complete and on time through 1882. I've confirmed 7 years of records. There is no legitimate back tax basis for any claim against this property." She tapped the Whitmore folder. "Their filing does not allege tax debt. It alleges survey error. Specifically, they're using a revised county plat from September 1881 that redraws your eastern boundary."
"A plat I've never seen."
"A plat that did not exist when you purchased this land."
She met his eyes.
"Mr. Rourke, county plats can be amended by the county surveyor with proper authorization. The question is, who authorized the 1881 revision, and on what basis? If Whitmore's people had access to the county surveyor's office—"
"Clyde Marsh has been county surveyor for 11 years, Daniel said. "I've never had cause to distrust him."
"Have you had cause to trust him?"
The question landed flat and honest, and he took a moment with it. "No," he said finally. "Not specifically."
"Then he's a variable." She pulled the blank sheet she'd been using for notes and turned it so he could read it. "The 1874 survey by Thomas Garrett is the document that matters. If it's in the state records office in Helena, it supersedes any county-level revision, regardless of when that revision was filed." She paused. "I need someone who can ride to Helena and request a certified copy. Not request it by mail. Go in person to the state archivist and wait for it."
"I can send Miles."
"Send someone whose face Whitmore's people won't recognize as coming from this ranch."
She looked at him steadily.
"If they're watching the mail and the county clerk's office, they may be watching for inquiries from you specifically."
He was quiet for a moment, and she could see him doing what she imagined Pinkerton work had trained him to do: mapping the situation, identifying the pressure points, deciding what he was willing to act on. "You think they have someone watching?"
"I think a fraud of this scale requires infrastructure. People in the right offices. People watching the right roads."
She folded her hands on the desk.
"In Cincinnati, Caldwell Land had a contact in the county assessor's office, one in the clerk's office, and a man at the telegraph relay station who flagged any messages relating to their target properties. By the time the property's owners realized they had a problem, Caldwell already knew every move they'd made trying to address it."
She held his gaze.
"I am not saying Whitmore has all of that in place here. I am saying the architecture of this claim looks like the work of someone who thinks ahead."
Daniel Rourke looked at her for a long moment.
"How do you know all of this?" "Because I spent 6 years recording the numbers that made it possible," she said, "and 18 months in a courtroom explaining what those numbers meant."
He nodded slowly, not with sympathy, but with the particular respect of a man who recognizes a specific kind of hard-won knowledge when he hears it. "What do you need from me?" "Your complete cooperation and complete honesty. If there is anything about the original purchase, the boundary surveys, or your dealings with the county in the past 8 years that you have not told me, I need to know it now, before I find it myself and have to wonder why you didn't mention it." "Nothing I'm aware of." He said it without the slight hesitation that meant there was something. "The purchase was clean. Garrett surveyed it himself, filed in Helena and at the county. I have the receipt." He stood and went to the cabinet on the far wall, opened the second drawer, and produced a paper envelope worn soft at the edges. "Survey receipt, purchase deed, and the original tax assessment from 1874.
Eleanor took the envelope with both hands, the way you handle something that matters, and set it carefully to the left of everything else on the desk. "This stays in this room," she said. "Locked, if that cabinet locks." "It does." "Good." She picked up her pen again. "I'll need 3 days to get through all of this properly. Possibly 4. Take whatever time you need." He moved toward the door, then paused with his hand on the frame, and she could see him deciding whether to say the next thing. He said it. "Miss Voss, I want you to know that whatever you find in those records, whatever it is, I want the truth of it, not a comfortable version." "I wouldn't give you any other kind," she said. He left without further comment, which she appreciated. She worked through the morning with the sustained focus that had always been her best professional quality. The ability to hold multiple threads of a complex account in her mind simultaneously, tracking where each one led and how they connected to the others. Ruth brought coffee at 8 and a plate of eggs at 9 without being asked, setting them at the edge of the desk with a brief, "Eat something," that carried the weight of a directive. Eleanor ate without breaking her concentration. By noon, she had confirmed 3 things. The tax records were clean. The original purchase documents were sound. And there was a gap, a specific surgical gap, in the filing receipts for the county plat office between August and October of 1881. Precisely the period during which the revised plat had supposedly been authorized and recorded. Someone had removed the authorization paperwork. Not lost it. Removed it. Because the adjacent receipts in the sequence were present and undamaged, and the gap had the clean edges of deliberate extraction, rather than the ragged disorder of simple loss. She was sitting with that fact, turning it over, when Pete Calloway knocked on the open study door at noon. "Miss Voss? Ruth says dinner's on." He leaned against the doorframe with the loose ease of a young man who wasn't quite sure of the etiquette here. "She also says if you don't come eat, she'll bring the plate back in here and stand over you. And she means it." "Tell her I'll be there in 5 minutes." Eleanor carefully placed a blank sheet over the record she'd been reviewing, a habit from Cincinnati when she didn't want anyone to see at a glance where she was in an audit. Then she looked at Pete. "The man you saw at the gate, the one who spoke with Marcus. Did he have anyone with him?" Pete straightened slightly. "A driver. Stayed up on the wagon the whole time." "Did the driver get down at any point? Walk around? Look at anything?" He thought about it. "He stepped down once, while the man in the suit was talking to Marcus. Walked toward the south fence line. I thought he was just stretching his legs." He paused. "But he was gone a while. Maybe 10 minutes. The south fence line. 3 cuts in the same location. "Thank you, Pete." He started to leave, then turned back. "Is it bad? Whatever you're finding in there?" Eleanor considered the honest answer against the kind answer, and decided they were the same answer. "It's what I expected to find, which means it's manageable." She stood and pushed back the chair. "Don't repeat that to anyone, not even Miles." "Yes, ma'am." He said it with the seriousness of a young man who understood that some information was being given to him in trust, and intended to prove he deserved it. The dinner table had the easy rhythm of a working ranch. Men who ate fast and talked briefly about the afternoon's work. Horses that needed the north paddock fence checked. A call about cattle from a neighboring ranch to the east. Eleanor listened without appearing to, the way she had learned to listen in offices, when the real information came in the spaces between formal conversation. Daniel ate at the head of the table, and she noticed that he asked each man a specific question about their morning's work. Not a general, "How's it going?" but a particular question that demonstrated he'd been paying attention. The horses in the north paddock, the cut fence line, the water level in the eastern trough. The men answered him the way men answer a leader they respect, rather than one they merely work for. She thought about what Pete had said the night before, about the ranch hand's departure.
about the driver walking the south fence line while his employer spoke with Marcus.
Someone had scouted that fence before the cuts began. The cuts were a message as much as a tactic. We know your land. We know your patterns. We know where you're not watching. Miles? She said during a pause in the conversation. The older man looked up. Miss Voss. When you rode the east fence line yesterday, did you go all the way to the creek? To the crossing, yes. And the boundary markers at the creek, the survey stakes from the original 1874 plat, are they still in place? Miles set down his fork. Something moved behind his eyes. They were there last spring. Haven't checked them recently. Could you check them this afternoon? He glanced at Daniel, who gave a single brief nod. I can do that, Miles said. Don't move them or mark them in any way. Just verify they're there and note their exact position. She picked up her coffee cup. If they've been moved, I need to know by how much and in which direction. The table had gone quiet in the particular way that meant everyone understood that this had stopped being a routine conversation. Pete Calloway was looking at his plate with great care. Ruth, in the kitchen doorway, had the expression of a woman who had suspected for some time that things were worse than she'd been told, and was being confirmed in that suspicion. Daniel Rourke was looking at Eleanor with an expression she was beginning to recognize, the focused attention of a man who has been handed a piece of information that rearranges other pieces he already had. They moved the stakes, he said. It wasn't quite a question. I don't know yet. She set down the cup. But if Whitmore's revised plat shows a different boundary than the original survey, the simplest way to make that claim look credible on the ground is to shift the physical markers. She looked at him steadily. Which means they've been on your land. More than once. And they came prepared. Miles pushed back from the table and picked up his hat from the hook by the door without waiting for further instruction. The screen door closed behind him with a sound like punctuation. Daniel said nothing for a long moment. The remaining men at the table looked at him with the attention of people waiting to understand the shape of what was coming. Finish your dinner, he said finally, to the table in general. His voice was level, which Eleanor was already learning meant that underneath it, something was not level at all. Then, to her specifically, quietly, after you've finished, come find me in the office. She nodded. She ate the rest of her meal without tasting it, her mind already back at the desk, already threading the new information through the pattern she'd been building all morning. The missing authorization paperwork, the revised plat, the driver who had walked the south fence line, the survey stakes that may or may not still be where Thomas Garrett had placed them in 1874. Each piece fit against the others with the terrible neatness of something that had been designed rather than happened. Gerald Whitmore had not simply seen an opportunity in Daniel Rourke's land. He had built the opportunity, piece by piece, over months, with the patience of a man who expected to win before the other party understood they were in a fight. Eleanor Voss had seen that patience before. She had also seen it lose. Daniel's office held the particular disorder of a man who was organized in his thinking, but not in his paperwork. Eleanor stood in the doorway for a moment and read it the way she read everything, looking for the pattern underneath the surface, the logic that explained how things had come to be the way they were. Ledgers stacked by year along the left wall, which was methodical. Correspondence piled on the desk without sorting, which meant he dealt with things immediately or not at all. No middle ground. A Pinkerton badge sitting in a glass dish on the corner of the desk, like something he'd set down one day and never found a reason to put away. She sat in the chair across from him without being asked. "Tell me what you think," Daniel said. He wasn't looking at the badge. He was looking at her.
I think Gerald Whitmore began planning this specific claim against your land approximately 18 months ago, Eleanor said. The revised county plat was filed in September of 1881. The groundwork for that filing, the relationship with whoever authorized the revision, the research into your original survey, the identification of your eastern boundary as the vulnerable point. That takes months of preparation. You don't manufacture a plat revision in a week. She set her folded hands on the desk.
I also think Marcus didn't leave for Denver. Daniel went still. What do you mean? I think he was removed. The distinction matters. She kept her voice even. A man who leaves for a better opportunity takes his system with him because it's his. He built it. It goes where he goes. A man who is pressured into leaving in a hurry takes what he can grab and leaves the rest. The records in that study were not packed by someone who was relocating. They were abandoned by someone who was frightened. She paused. The question is whether Whitmore's people simply scared him off, or whether they made him a specific offer in exchange for specific cooperation. You think he took something? I think the gap in the county plat authorization receipts is too clean to be accidental, and I think someone with access to this office made it possible. She said it plainly, without softening it, because softening it would have been a form of dishonesty she wasn't willing to offer him. I don't know that it was Marcus. I don't have proof of that yet. But it's a question that needs an answer. Daniel picked up the Pinkerton badge from the glass dish, turned it over once in his hand, and set it back down. It was the gesture of a man touching something familiar when he needed to think. Not nostalgia, but instinct. I hired Marcus on the recommendation of the Coldwater bank manager, Sam Fuller. Is Fuller a man you trust? I thought so. He looked at the badge. 11 years I've been doing business with that bank. Fuller handled the financing on the second barn. He was quiet for a moment. If Fuller is connected to Whitmore, then your financial records at that bank are potentially visible to Whitmore's people as well. Eleanor said it before he finished the thought, because they had arrived at it at the same moment, and there was no point in being delicate about it. Which means they know your operating margins, your cattle sale income, how long you could sustain a legal fight before it became a financial problem. Daniel stood up from his chair, moved to the window, and stood with his back to her for a moment. She gave him that moment without filling it. 8 years I spent watching people operate exactly like this, he said finally, still facing the window. Chicago, St. Louis. Land fraud, railroad fraud, bank fraud. The mechanism is always the same. Find the weakness, manufacture the pressure, buy the outcome before the other man understands he's in a transaction. He turned back around. I left that work because I watched a man I built a case against walk free because he had more money than the agency wanted to fight. I came out here specifically to be somewhere that kind of thing couldn't reach. He stopped. I was not paying enough attention. You were running a cattle operation on 4,800 acres, Eleanor said. You were paying the kind of attention that job requires. You weren't paying the other kind because you had no reason to think you needed to. She met his eyes. That's not a failure. That's what they counted on. Something shifted in his expression. Not gratitude exactly, but the particular look of a man who has been offered a true thing at a moment when he needed one. He sat back down. What do we do? The state records in Helena are the foundation of everything. Your original 1874 survey by Thomas Garrett, filed with the state archivist, supersedes any county-level revision, regardless of how that revision was authorized or who signed off on it. She pulled the sheet of notes she'd brought from the study. But a certified copy from Helena alone won't be enough, because Whitmore's attorney will argue the county revision was legally authorized, and the state record simply predates the corrected survey. We need the authorization paperwork for the 1881 revision. Specifically, who requested it, who approved it,
And on what evidentiary basis? Which is missing from the county files. Missing from the county files, she agreed. But authorization paperwork goes in 2 GK surveyor files 1 copy. The requesting party, whoever commissioned the revision, files another with her own attorney as proof of the process. She GK tapped the Whitmore folder. Prescott Helms and Billings prepared this filing. He would have required proof of proper authorization before he put his name on a land claim. That proof exists somewhere, GTK. She paused. An attorney's files are not public. GTK her for a moment. Daniel looked at saying, we let it go to court. I'm saying we make sure that when it goes to court, we're the ones who have already found everything. She folded her hands on the notes. GTK Whitmore is expecting a rancher who will fight this the way ranchers fight land disputes. Hire a local attorney. Argue the merits. Hope the judge is fair. He is not expecting someone who has spent 6 years inside the machinery of exactly this kind of fraud and knows where every piece is kept. The sound of the screen door and boots on the porch boards came from the front of the house, and a moment later, Miles Cutter appeared in the office doorway. His face had the set expression of a man delivering a report he would have preferred not to be making. "Stakes have been moved," he said. He pulled off his hat and held it at his side. "Both of them. The northern stake is off about 14 inches to the west. The southern one is further, closer to 2 feet. He looked at Daniel. They used fresh cedar posts, same as our original stakes, same dimensions. If you weren't looking for it, you'd read them as original. The room was quiet. Eleanor said, "When you pulled the stake, was there a hole beneath it? Remnant of the original placement?" "Yes, ma'am, both of them. Old hole filled in with loose dirt. New post dropped in beside it and tamped down." "Professional work," she said, more to herself than to the room. Someone who knew surveying, not a random hired man, someone with specific technical knowledge. She looked at Daniel. "Thomas Garrett is still practicing in Helena. If Whitmore hired a competing surveyor to stake the revised boundary on the ground, that surveyor filed a report with someone. Those reports have names on them." Miles looked at Daniel. "You want me to ride to Helena?" "Tomorrow morning," Daniel said. "Early. Go to the state archivist first. The name is Thomas Garrett, 1874 survey, Rourke parcel, Powell County. Get a certified copy, in hand, witnessed. Then find Garrett himself if you can." He paused. "Miles, don't tell anyone in town where you're going. Not the livery, not the post office. Say you're going to Billings." Miles nodded once, put his hat back on, and left without further comment. That was Miles Cutter, entire. A man who understood that some situations called for more words and some called for fewer, and had the judgment to tell them apart. In the silence after he left, Eleanor became aware of how late the afternoon had gotten. The quality of the light through the window had changed. She had been at the desk or in this chair for the better part of 12 hours, and she felt it in her back and in the particular tiredness behind her eyes that came from sustained concentration. "You should eat," Daniel said. "I know." She didn't move immediately because there was one more thing. "I need to tell you something, and I want you to hear it as information rather than apology." She waited until he looked at her directly. When Caleb Hargrove's advertisement appeared in the Cincinnati paper, I researched him. I wrote to the post office in Coldwater for confirmation he existed. I cross-referenced his description of the property against county records I could access from Ohio, and I verified that a Hargrove cattle operation was listed in the Montana Territorial Business Registry. She paused. I was careful. I was more careful than most women who answer those advertisements. And I was still wrong about him. What I'm telling you is that being careful doesn't mean being immune to being deceived by someone who anticipated your carefulness. She could see him working out why she was saying this. He got there. You're telling me the same might apply to your read on this situation, that Whitmore may have anticipated someone with your specific knowledge being brought in. It's possible, she said it steadily. I don't think it's likely. My being here is accidental in a way that's hard to engineer in advance.
But I want you to know that I know it's possible, because I would rather tell you that than have you discover I hadn't thought of it. Daniel Rourke looked at her for a long moment, with the focused, assessing attention that she was beginning to understand was simply how he looked at things he considered important. Miss Voss, he said, in 8 years of Pinkerton work, the thing that got more cases broken than any other single factor was having someone in the room who would say the uncomfortable true thing rather than the comfortable, easy thing. He paused. That is not a quality I take for granted. She had no answer for that didn't veer into territory she wasn't ready for. So she stood, picked up her notes, and said, I'll be back at the desk after supper. You'll be at the desk after supper when Ruth permits it, he said. And there was something in his voice that was not quite dry humor and not quite warmth, but something in between that she found, to her own slight surprise, that she didn't dislike. Ruth permitted it, as it turned out, only after Eleanor had eaten a full plate of beans and cornbread and drunk 2 cups of coffee, all of which Ruth supervised with the calm authority of a woman who understood that a person's usefulness was directly related to whether they'd been fed. Pete Calloway washed dishes without being asked and maintained a cheerful running commentary about nothing consequential, a particular talent, Eleanor was beginning to notice, that he deployed whenever the atmosphere in the house got heavy. A young man who understood that sometimes the best thing you could do for a room was change its weather. She was back at the desk by 7:30, and Daniel came in at 8 and sat in the corner chair without explanation, a book open in his hands that she suspected he was not actually reading. She didn't ask about it. She worked. He sat. The lamp between them made a small, warm space in the darkness, and outside, the Montana night had that enormous quiet that still startled her slightly every time she noticed it. Tell me about the Cincinnati case, he said, after a while. Not pushing, just asking. She moved a ledger page to the completed stack before she answered. Charles Caldwell built a land acquisition company over 12 years in Ohio and Indiana. Bought distressed farm properties, subdivided them, sold parcels to settlers at a markup. Legitimate business for the first 8 years. She picked up her pen. Then, the railroad expansion changed the value of agricultural land near the right-of-way, and Caldwell decided legitimate business was too slow. He began manufacturing distressed properties rather than waiting for them to appear. She kept her eyes on the ledger. I had been his head bookkeeper for 4 years by the time the fraud began. I recorded what he told me to record. I asked questions about entries that didn't balance, and was given explanations that were internally consistent, which is how very good fraud works. It answers the questions you think to ask. When did you realize? A seller came into the office. A woman, about 60, had owned a farm near Columbus for 30 years. She said her tax assessment had been wrong for 2 years running, and she'd been trying to correct it with the county, but kept being told the records confirmed the assessment. Eleanor set down the pen. Her records and the county records were different. I could see it when I looked at both. The county number had been changed. Not forged badly, changed well. By someone who understood how assessors' records were structured. She looked at the lamp. I went back through 18 months of Caldwell's acquisitions that same night. Found the pattern in about 4 hours. Took it to the federal land office the next morning, and Caldwell's attorneys went after you. They claimed I had participated in structuring the false entries. They had documents with my signature on them. Documents I had signed without realizing what I was authorizing, because the fraud was layered in a way that made individual transactions look normal. She picked up the pen again.
I was cleared. The federal examiner confirmed I had been the one who identified and reported the scheme. But Caldwell's lead attorney made sure my name was in every newspaper account as a person of interest in the investigation. By the time I was formally cleared, the damage was permanent. Daniel said nothing for a moment. Then, "The attorney who went after you."
Do you know what happened to him? He's a federal judge now, Eleanor said, without expression.
In the Southern District of Ohio. The silence after that had a particular quality that she recognized as a man deciding whether to say something. He said it. "I'm sorry that happened to you." "Don't be sorry," she said. "Be useful." She heard the sharpness in it and amended it slightly. "I mean that practically, not rudely. I've had enough people be sorry. What I needed, then, was one person in a position to do something who would act on what I brought them before the narrative had time to set." She looked at him across the desk. "That's what I'm doing here, Mr. Rourke. Acting before the narrative sets." He looked at her steadily. "Daniel," he said, "we're past Mr. Rourke." She let a beat pass. "Daniel," she said.
He went back to his book, and she went back to the ledgers, and the lamp burned between them, and neither of them spoke again for a long time, which was its own kind of conversation. She found it at 10:15. She almost didn't see it. It was in the ranch supply ledger for 1881, tucked between a payment to a wire fencing supplier and a delivery receipt for winter feed, a line item recorded by Marcus in a slightly different hand than his usual entries. Smaller, slightly cramped, like a man writing something quickly that he wanted to look like it had always been there. A consulting fee. $40. Payee initials only. G.W. $40 was 2 weeks of a bookkeeper's wages. G.W. Gerald Whitmore. Eleanor set down her pen, very carefully, and looked at the entry for a long moment without touching it. Then she said, without raising her voice, "Daniel." He looked up from his book immediately, reading something in her tone. "What is it?" She turned the ledger toward him and put her finger beside the line. He leaned forward, read it, leaned back. The expression on his face was not anger, exactly. It was something colder than anger. The particular look of a man who has just had a suspicion confirmed that he had been hoping wouldn't be confirmed. "He was paid before he left," Eleanor said. This was recorded 6 weeks before Whitmore's attorney filed the claim, before the revised plat was introduced as evidence, before anyone on this ranch had any reason to be looking for something like this. She kept her voice even. Marcus knew the claim was coming because he helped prepare the ground for it. The missing authorization receipts, the disordered records, the absence of any system for the state plat records. That was not carelessness. It was preparation. Daniel stood up from the chair. He moved to the window and stood with his hands flat on the sill, and she could see the effort it cost him to stay still. 8 years of Pinkerton work, she thought, had given him a very high threshold before he acted on anger. But underneath that threshold, the anger was real, and it was significant. "He ate at my table for 2 years, Daniel said quietly. "Yes. I paid for his mother's doctor in Butte when she was sick." "Yes." He was quiet for a long time. Outside, a horse moved in the corral, the sound of hooves on packed earth carrying clearly in the night silence. "How solid is that entry as evidence?" he said finally, without turning around. "As a single piece, not solid enough. As part of a pattern, the timing, the missing receipts, the moved stakes, the convenient departure, it becomes significantly stronger." She put the ledger carefully to one side. "We can't use it in isolation, but we don't have to. What we need it for right now is to tell us where to look next." She paused. $40 was the first payment. There was very likely a second one after Marcus confirmed the records were sufficiently disordered. That payment went somewhere. A bank account, a money order, a transaction that left a mark. She looked at Daniel's back. If Marcus is in Denver, he is findable. He turned around. I know people in Denver. Pinkerton people? Former. Good ones. His jaw was set, but his voice was controlled. Men who owe me from cases we worked together. Men who know how to find a person who doesn't want to be found, and ask them questions in a way that produces honest answers. He looked at her across the desk. If Marcus can be found and brought to account, does it help our case? A sworn statement from Marcus confirming that he was paid by Whitmore or by Whitmore's agent to remove the authorization receipts and disorder the records would be the single most powerful piece of evidence available to us, short of the Helena survey itself. She met his eyes. It would also expose Whitmore to criminal charges beyond the civil land claim. Suborning fraud, tampering with county records, potentially conspiracy. She held his gaze. That changes the stakes for him considerably. A man who is planning to take 800 acres of your land might decide the cost of continuing is too high if he's suddenly looking at federal charges. Daniel Rourke crossed back to his chair and sat down. He put his elbows on his knees and looked at the floor for a moment, and Eleanor let him think without interrupting, because she could see that he was assembling something. Not just the strategy for the records and the lawyers, but something larger. The decision about what kind of fight this was going to be. When he looked up, something had settled in his face. The anger was still there, but it had found its place underneath the determination, which was where it was most useful. We need to move quickly, he said. Miles to Helena tomorrow.
A wire to Denver tonight, if the telegraph office has night hours. He paused.
And Whitmore doesn't know yet that you're here, or what you found. That window will close as soon as anyone in Coldwater mentions your name to the wrong person. Then we should assume we have a week, Eleanor said. Perhaps less. A week, he said. Can you have what you need in a week? She looked at the stacks of records, the Whitmore folder, the ledger with its damning $40 entry, the envelope with Daniel's original purchase documents locked carefully in the cabinet. She thought about the state archivist in Helena, and the attorney in Billings, and the former Pinkerton men in Denver, and the gap in the authorization receipts that someone had assumed would never be noticed. She thought about Charles Caldwell's lead attorney, who was now a federal judge, and about the 18 months she had spent being sorry when she should have been doing exactly this. Yes, she said.
I can have it in a week. Miles left before sunrise, taking the north road out of the ranch with no lantern and no announcement. The way a man leaves when he understands that being seen matters as much as what he does once he arrives. Eleanor heard the hoofbeats from her room and lay still in the dark for a moment, tracking the sound until it faded into the Montana distance. And then she got up and lit the lamp and went back to work. The telegraph to Denver had gone out the night before, sent by Daniel himself from the Coldwater office at 9 in the evening. He had not told the operator what it was for, had framed it as a business inquiry to a cattle broker, which was close enough to plausible that a casual reader wouldn't question it. The operator was a man named Grubb, who had worked that office for 7 years and had, according to Ruth, the conversational habits of a woman at a quilting bee. Everything that passed through that telegraph office passed through Grubb's mouth within 48 hours. Daniel had written the message accordingly. Eleanor spent the fourth morning working backward through the supply ledgers from 1881, looking for additional payments to the GW initials or any variation of them. She found 2 more. One in October of 1881, $15 recorded as a freight handling fee with no corresponding delivery receipt, and one in December, $25, labeled miscellaneous contractor, also without documentation. $80 total across 3 entries, each one small enough to pass unremarked in a working ranch's accounts.
each one timed to a specific phase of what she now understood was a coordinated campaign. October was when the revised county plat had been filed.
December was 2 months after, which was when, she cross-referenced against the Whitmore filing, Prescott Helms had submitted the formal land claim to the territorial court in Billings. Marcus had been paid for preparation, for the filing, and for the submission. 3 phases, 3 payments, clean and methodical. She wrote it all down in the precise sequence and sat back in her chair and felt the particular cold clarity that came when a fraud structure became fully visible. It was never satisfying, exactly. It was more like the feeling of identifying a fracture in a load-bearing beam. Useful knowledge, necessary knowledge, but knowledge that came with the weight of understanding what had nearly fallen on someone. Ruth knocked on the study door at 8:30. "Man at the gate," she said. Her voice was level, but Eleanor had been around Ruth Sampson long enough by now to hear what lived underneath the level. "Says his name is Hargrove." Eleanor set down her pen. She turned in the chair slowly. "Caleb Hargrove. He's got a hired man with him. Stayed on the wagon." Ruth's eyes were measuring her with the careful attention of a woman who had watched enough situations turn sideways to know when to be very still. "Daniel's in the north pasture with Pete. I can send someone." "How long to reach him?" 15 minutes, maybe 20. Eleanor thought about the shape of Caleb Hargrove's fraud. Smaller than Whitmore's, more personal. The kind a man commits when he wants something specific from a specific person, rather than a territorial land grab. She thought about the 11 cents, and the depot stove, and the 8 pages of letters she'd fed into it herself. She thought about arriving at this ranch by accident, and spending 4 days discovering that her particular skills were exactly what was needed to dismantle something that would have taken Daniel Rourke's land and his livelihood if it had been allowed to complete itself. She thought about what she told Pete Calloway on the first night. Some information is given in trust. She stood up from the desk, smoothed her dress with both hands, and said, "Don't send for Daniel yet. I'll speak with him at the gate." Ruth looked at her for a moment. "You sure about that?" "No," Eleanor said honestly. "Send someone to the north pasture, but give me 10 minutes first." She walked to the gate with Ruth, 2 steps behind her, and Miles's absence very present in the space where his steadiness usually lived. Pete was in the north pasture. The remaining hands were with the cattle on the east range. The ranch had the particular vulnerability of a normal working morning, which was probably not accidental timing. Caleb Hargrove was taller than his correspondence had implied, and better dressed than a man should be for a ranch call, which told her everything about the nature of this visit. He had the easy confidence of someone accustomed to being received, and when he saw her come through the gate, he arranged his features into something that was meant to look like relief. "Grace," he said, and then corrected himself when her expression didn't move. "Miss Voss, I cannot tell you how glad I am to see you safe." "I'm sure." Eleanor stopped at a distance that was polite and completely impractical for any kind of physical approach. "What do you want, Mr. Hargrove?" The relief shifted slightly on his face, recalibrating. "I want to explain. The circumstances that kept me from meeting your train were not circumstances," she said. "I've read enough fraudulent correspondence in my professional life to recognize the structure of yours in retrospect. You had no intention of meeting that train." The advertisement was designed to bring a specific type of woman, educated, capable, with no local connections, to a location where you could make use of her skills without the cost of legitimate employment. She watched his face do its work. "What I can't determine from here is whether the plan ended with the books or extended further. Given that you found me here and came to collect me in person, I suspect the books were only the beginning." The hired man on the wagon shifted his weight.
Eleanor noted it without looking at him directly. Hargrove's manufactured relief had finished its performance, and what was underneath it was more honest and considerably less pleasant. "You're working for Rourke," he said. "I'm employed by Mr. Rourke, yes." "Doing his books?" "Among other things." Something moved behind his eyes, a calculation being run, a variable being reassessed. "You should know that your position here is not as secure as you believe.
Rourke's land claim is going to be decided against him in the territorial court. When that happens,
How do you know about the land claim?" she asked it quietly, without alarm in her voice, because alarm was something she could not afford to show him. He heard the question land, and she saw him understand he'd said something he hadn't meant to. He recovered quickly, which told her he'd done this before. "It's common knowledge in Coldwater. A claim of that size against a ranch that prominent isn't common knowledge," she said. "The filing is in the territorial court record, which is public. But the specific nature of the survey dispute and the acreage involved are details that require either reading the full legal document or having a conversation with someone who has." She held his gaze. "Who told you, Mr.
Hargrove?" He smiled, and it was a different smile than the relief had been. Sharper, with the slight contempt of a man who has decided he no longer needs the pleasant version. "You're very good at that," he said. "The questions. Pinkerton style." He glanced at the main house behind her. "Did Rourke teach you that, or did you already know it when you arrived?" Eleanor felt the specific cold that came when a situation clarified itself into something more dangerous than it had appeared. Hargrove wasn't here because he'd lost a mail-order bride. He was here because someone had sent him. And the someone who would have both the knowledge of Daniel's land claim and the motivation to send an agent to this ranch at this precise moment was not a complicated question. "Gerald Whitmore," she said. Not a question. His smile didn't change, which was its own answer. "You should come inside." She said it without moving aside, without any inflection that made it an invitation. "And your man should stay on the wagon." "I don't think—" "Mr. Hargrove," she let a beat pass. "I have built a complete evidentiary record of the fraud against this property. I have documentation of 3 payments to a former employee of this ranch, timed precisely to each phase of Whitmore's campaign. I have the original 1874 state survey en route from Helena as we speak. And I have a contact in Denver currently locating the former employee in question for the purpose of obtaining a sworn statement." She watched his face do the thing faces did when a situation the speaker had believed was in their control was revealed not to be. "What I don't have yet is the connection between Whitmore's operation and whatever arrangement you made with him. But I will have it, because that connection leaves a record the same way every other piece of this has left a record. And I am very good at finding records." She tilted her head slightly. "So you can come inside and tell me what you know voluntarily, or you can get back on that wagon and I will find it without your help, and you will have no opportunity to shape how your role in this is characterized when it goes before a federal examiner." The silence that followed was long enough that Ruth, behind her, shifted her weight once. Hargrove got down from his horse. He came inside, sat at the kitchen table, and told her what he knew, which was less than Eleanor had implied she already had, and more than she'd actually expected. He was, as she had suspected from his correspondence, not a principal in Whitmore's operation, but a functionary, a man who ran various small errands of recruitment and misdirection for a fee. The advertisement for a mail-order bride had been Whitmore's idea, designed to introduce a controllable woman into Rourke's household who could provide information about the state of his records. Hargrove had written the letters. He had not met the train because his usefulness had ended at recruitment, and Whitmore's people had expected to manage the rest.
Except the woman they'd recruited had turned out to be Eleanor Voss. She wrote down everything he said in her precise hand and made him sign the bottom of each page, which he did with the defeated compliance of a man who had understood too late what room he had walked into. When Daniel came through the kitchen door 20 minutes into the conversation, having been found by the ranch hand Ruth had sent, he took in the scene with a single quick assessment. Eleanor at the table, pen in hand, a man he didn't know signing papers with the expression of someone who had lost a negotiation comprehensively, and sat down at the far end of the table without speaking, which was exactly the right thing to do.
When Hargrove had signed the last page, and Eleanor had blotted the ink and added her own signature as witness, she folded the papers into the leather document case she'd found in the study and said, "You'll need to provide a sworn deposition before a notary before this is useful in a legal proceeding. I'd like that done in Billings rather than Coldwater, at a notary who has no connection to the local bank." She looked at Hargrove steadily. "Can you be in Billings by Thursday?" He looked at the papers in her hands and then at Daniel at the end of the table and said, "Yes." After he left, Ruth poured 2 cups of coffee and set them on the table and went back to the kitchen without comment, which was Ruth's way of indicating that the situation had been handled to her satisfaction. Daniel picked up his cup. He looked at Eleanor with an expression she was learning to read, the combination of careful attention and the slight restraint of a man who had something to say and was deciding how to say it accurately. "You knew who he was connected to before he told you." "I suspected it as soon as he mentioned the land claim." She picked up her own cup. The specific details he had were not public information. The only people with both the motivation and the access were Whitmore's people. She paused. "What I didn't know was the mechanism. That the mail order advertisement was designed to place an informant in your household. That was more sophisticated than I'd given Whitmore credit for." He was expecting a different kind of woman. He was expecting a woman who would be grateful enough for the position to be manageable. She held the cup in both hands. That's the other thing fraud depends on. Anticipating how people will behave based on their circumstances. Whitmore looked at the advertisement, at the kind of woman likely to answer it, and assumed desperation made people predictable. She set down the cup. "It often does. He wasn't wrong to think it." "He was wrong about you." "He didn't know about me specifically. He knew about the general case." She looked at him directly. "The general case is usually correct. I am not the general case." Daniel was quiet for a moment. Outside, Pete Calloway could be heard coming back from the north pasture, his voice carrying as he called something to one of the other hands. Easy and unconcerned, the sound of a young man who didn't yet know what had just happened at the gate. Eleanor was glad of it. Pete's particular kind of uncomplicated warmth was something she hadn't known she needed until she'd had 4 days of it. "When Miles gets back from Helena," Daniel said, "and the Denver contact finds Marcus, assuming both of those go as planned, what does our position look like?" Eleanor thought through it in the way she thought through audit conclusions, not reaching for the answer she wanted, but following the numbers where they led. "Strong," she said. "The original state survey supersedes the county revision on its face. The 3 payments to Marcus, combined with his signed statement if we can get it, establish deliberate fraud rather than innocent error, which changes the legal standard considerably. Hargrove's statement connects Whitmore personally to the scheme rather than allowing him to claim his attorneys acted without his direct involvement." She paused. "The weak point remains the county surveyor. If Clyde Marsh authorized the 1881 revision under pressure or inducement from Whitmore's people, his testimony could go either way. He might cooperate if he believes Whitmore's protection is no longer reliable. He might not." She met Daniel's eyes.
That's the variable I can't resolve from this desk. Marsh has a daughter in Billings, Daniel said. Married to a hardware merchant. Marsh himself has been talking about retiring for 2 years, wants to move to Billings and be near the grandchildren. He turned his cup in his hands. A man who wants to retire and move to his grandchildren is a man who does not want a federal fraud charge following him there. Eleanor looked at him. You've been thinking about Marsh. I've been thinking about everything since the night you showed me that ledger entry. He set down the cup. I know these people, Eleanor. I know their circumstances, their pressures, what they want, and what they're afraid of. That's what I can bring to this that the documents alone can't.
He paused, and she noticed he'd used her given name without marking it, the way people do when it's become natural rather than deliberate. You know how the fraud was built. I know the people who were recruited to build it. Between those two things, we don't need to hope the judge is fair, she said. No, we don't. The telegraph reply from Denver came that afternoon, delivered by a boy from Coldwater, who handed it to Ruth at the back door with the incurious efficiency of someone who delivered messages all day and had stopped reading them. Ruth brought it to the study without opening it, set it on the corner of the desk, and left. Eleanor looked at the envelope for a moment before she picked it up, aware that what was inside it would either close the primary gap in their evidence or extend the uncertainty another week. She picked it up, opened it, read it, and set it down. Then she went to find Daniel. He was at the corral, watching a young horse work the fence line with the patient attention of a man who understood that some things couldn't be hurried. He heard her footsteps and turned before she spoke. She held out the telegraph. They found Marcus, she said. He's in Denver. He's willing to talk. Daniel took the paper and read it. His jaw worked once. Willing to talk could mean anything from a full confession to a carefully managed version designed to minimize his own exposure, and they both knew it. But willing to talk meant findable, reachable, potentially persuadable. It meant the door was open. My contact says Marcus has been staying in a boarding house near the rail yards, Daniel said, still reading. Says he like a man who hasn't been sleeping. He folded the paper. A man who hasn't been sleeping has a conscience that's still working. Or he's afraid, Eleanor said. Could be both. He handed the paper back to her. I should go. She looked at him. To Denver. Hargrove will depose in Billings on Thursday. That's handled. Miles will be back from Helena by tomorrow evening with the certified survey. He was already running the sequence in his mind. She could see it in the set of his face. Marcus is the piece that makes everything else conclusive. And he won't give a full statement to a stranger. He might give one to me. Because he knows you. Because he ate at my table for 2 years, and I paid for his mother's doctor in Butte. The bitterness in it was real, but controlled. That means something, even to a man who sold what he sold. Maybe especially to that man. He looked at her. I'd be gone 4 days, 5 at most. Can you hold everything here for 5 days? Eleanor thought about the record she'd built, locked in the cabinet with Daniel's original documents. She thought about Ruth, who ran the house like a general runs a campaign, and Miles, who would be back tomorrow, and Pete Calloway, whose instincts about the man at the gate had been right from the beginning. She thought about Gerald Whitmore, who had been expecting a desperate woman and had gotten something considerably different, and who did not yet know the full scope of what was assembled against him. Yes, she said. Go. He left the next morning before sunrise, the same way Miles had left, quietly, without ceremony, the kind of departure that was its own statement about the seriousness of what it was going toward. Eleanor stood on the porch in the dark and listened to the hoofbeats until she couldn't hear them anymore. And then she went inside and lit the lamp and sat down at the desk. She had the survey documents, the ledger entries, the payment records, and Hargrove's signed statement.
She had the shape of the fraud, from its foundation to its most recent operation.
What she was still missing was the authorization paperwork for the 1881 county plat revision, and she had spent 4 days believing that document was gone, removed by Marcus at Whitmore's direction. But the night before Daniel left, something Hargrove had said in the kitchen had stayed in her mind. He had described his role as managing recruitment and misdirection. Misdirection implied a misdirector and a misdirected party. If Marcus had been paid to remove the authorization paperwork and disorder the records, the misdirection was aimed at Daniel, aimed at making the fraud look like negligence rather than engineering, which meant the authorization paperwork itself still existed somewhere. Whitmore's attorney would have it. Whitmore's own files would have it. And there was one other place it might be. A place that existed specifically because county records were fallible, and important documents needed a backup.
The Montana Territorial Archivist in Helena maintained duplicates of significant county land authorizations. Not all of them. The office didn't have the capacity. But survey revisions that affected properties over 1,000 acres were subject to mandatory dual filing under an 1879 territorial statute that almost nobody knew existed, because it had been added as a technical amendment to a larger infrastructure bill and had never been separately publicized. Eleanor knew it existed because she had spent a month in Cincinnati reading every land regulation on the books in 6 Western territories as part of her attempt to educate herself before answering Hargrove's advertisement. She picked up her pen and wrote a second letter for Miles to carry back to Helena when he returned, addressed to the Territorial Archivist, requesting a certified copy of the authorization file for the 1881 Powell County Survey revision. She wrote it with the precise, authoritative language of someone who knew exactly what she was asking for and exactly why it existed. Then she sealed it, set it beside the lamp where Miles would see it when he came in, and went back to work. Outside, the Montana morning was coming up cold and clear, the way it did out here, without gradation or apology. And somewhere in the records on that desk, in the shape of numbers and dates and signatures, the full truth of what Gerald Whitmore had built was waiting to be read by someone who knew the language. Eleanor Voss knew the language better than anyone he had ever underestimated. Miles came back from Helena on the evening of the 5th day, his horse road-worn and his saddlebag considerably heavier than when he'd left. He handed Eleanor 2 envelopes at the kitchen table without preamble, one thick, one thin, and accepted the coffee Ruth put in front of him with the gratitude of a man who had been cold for a long time. The thick envelope was the certified copy of Thomas Garrett's 1874 survey, stamped and witnessed by the state archivist. Every boundary line and measurement recorded in Garrett's precise hand, exactly as Daniel's original purchase documents described them. The eastern boundary ran to Powder Creek, 4,800 acres, clear title, no ambiguity. The thin envelope was what Eleanor had asked him to retrieve with her second letter, the dual-filed authorization record for the 1881 County Plat revision. She opened it at the table, with Miles watching, and Pete Calloway pretending to be interested in his coffee cup, and read through it in the particular silence that came over her when she was moving through a document that mattered. The authorization had been requested by a land surveying firm called Montana Territorial Survey Associates, incorporated in October of 1880, 1 year before the revision, with a registered agent listed as Prescott Helms, the same Billings attorney who had filed Whitmore's land claim. The authorization had been approved by Clyde Marsh, county surveyor, on August 14, 1881. And in the signature block, where the requesting party was required to identify the beneficial interest behind the survey revision, someone had written, in handwriting that was not Helms's careful legal script, but the broader, more impatient hand of a man who signed many documents quickly, G. E. Whitmore,
Chicago, Illinois. Gerald Whitmore had signed the authorization request himself. Eleanor set the document down and looked at the lamp for a moment. In her experience, which was considerable, men who committed large frauds rarely made this particular error, putting their own name on the initiating document. They used intermediaries precisely to avoid it. The fact that Whitmore had signed this himself meant either that he had believed the dual filing statute didn't exist, which was possible given how obscure it was, or that he had believed Marcus would remove both copies, which Marcus had apparently not known about. Either way, it was the single most valuable piece of paper in the leather document case. "Miles," she said without looking up. "Thank you." "Find what you needed?" "More than I needed." She squared the document against the desk edge and added it to the case. "Is there anything in Coldwater that Whitmore's people would know about before Daniel gets back?" Miles considered it with the unhurried thoroughness of a man who thought about things completely before he answered them. "Grub at the telegraph office talks, but I went to the Helena depot directly, not through Coldwater. And the second letter went with me in my coat, not through the mail." He drank his coffee.
Nobody in Coldwater knows I went to Helena. Nobody knows what I brought back. She nodded. "Then we have a few days yet before they realize the position has changed." Pete Calloway looked up from his coffee cup, unable to hold the performance of disinterest any longer. "What position? How bad is it for Whitmore?" Eleanor looked at him across the table. He was 22 years old and had trusted her from the first night, on nothing more than instinct and the quality of her questions. She thought he deserved a real answer. Gerald Whitmore signed his own name to the document that initiated the fraudulent survey revision. His attorney filed the land claim. His paid agent inside this ranch disordered the records. We have all three of those facts in documentation. She paused. It is very bad for Whitmore. Pete sat back in his chair with the exhale of a man who has been holding his breath without knowing it. "Good," he said simply. Daniel came home on the morning of the 6th day. Eleanor heard the horse before she saw him, and went to the porch without deciding to. He looked the way a man looks after 4 hard days of travel, and one very specific conversation. Tired in the body, awake in the eyes, carrying something that needed to be put down in the right place before it could be set aside. He dismounted at the corral and handed the reins to Pete without looking away from her. "Marcus talked," he said when he reached the porch steps. "Everything?" "Everything." He came up the steps. All 3 payments, the instruction to remove the authorization receipts, the name Whitmore's agent used to contact him, the specific records he was told to disorder. He stopped in front of her. His voice was level, but she could hear what was underneath it. The weight of having sat across a table from a man he'd trusted and listened to him explain, in plain terms, how he'd chosen to betray that trust. He cried. During the deposition, "My contact said he'd been trying to leave Denver for 2 weeks and couldn't make himself do it." "Where will he go?" "South, Texas maybe. I gave him enough for a stage ticket and told him if he stayed sober and stayed honest, the deposition would be the end of his involvement in this." He looked at her steadily. "You think that was wrong?" "I think it was your decision to make," she said. "And I think a man who couldn't make himself leave Denver for 2 weeks is probably not going to become someone's paid agent again." She paused. "I also think we have enough without him now. His statement is confirmatory, not foundational. The foundation is in there." She nodded toward the study. "Come see what Miles brought back from Helena." He read through everything at the desk while she stood to the side and watched his face move through the documents. The certified survey, the dual filing authorization,
the sequence of payments. Hargrove's signed statement. When he reached the authorization page with Whitmore's signature, he stopped, read it twice, set it down. "He signed it himself," Daniel said. "He believed the record didn't exist. Or he believed Marcus had removed it." "Either way," he looked up, "this is enough." "Yes," she said. "It is." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the assembled documents. Everything in the case, organized and sequenced in the order a federal examiner would need to read it, with Eleanor's summary pages at the front of each section, explaining precisely what each document demonstrated and how it connected to the others. 8 days of work. The complete architecture of Whitmore's fraud, mapped from its foundation to its most recent operation, in language clear enough that anyone who could read could follow it. "I need to send a wire to my attorney in Billings," Daniel said, "and one to the Federal Land Office examiner in Helena. They'll want to review this before any hearing." He stood from the chair.
How long before Whitmore figures out what we have? He may already suspect something is wrong. The cut fence stopped after Miles left for Helena, which suggests whoever was watching the south boundary line reported that our movements had changed. A man like Whitmore reads changes in pattern. She folded her hands. "I'd say we have until the end of the week before he tries something. What that something is, I can't predict." It came sooner than that. The following morning, Prescott Helms himself rode out from Coldwater in a hired buggy, accompanied by a man Eleanor didn't recognize, who carried a leather briefcase and had the overpressed, uncomfortable look of a city lawyer deposited in country he didn't understand. Helms was a lean man in his 50s, with careful eyes and the kind of professional composure that took years to build and could be read, if you knew how, like a document itself. His composure, Eleanor noted as she came to the gate with Daniel, was showing strain at the edges. "Mr. Rourke," Helms touched his hat. "I was hoping we might speak privately about the survey matter." "Miss Voss handles my land records," Daniel said. "Anything you have to say about the survey matter, you say in front of her." Helms looked at Eleanor with an assessment that was professional rather than dismissive. A lawyer looking at someone who might be a complication. "Miss Voss, I've heard your name in connection with the Caldwell land case in Cincinnati." "Then you know I'm familiar with this type of situation," Eleanor said. Something moved behind his careful eyes. He had done the same arithmetic she had expected Whitmore to do, and he had apparently reached a different conclusion than his client. "Mr. Rourke," he said, "Mr. Whitmore is prepared to withdraw the survey claim in exchange for a mutual agreement not to pursue further action." The silence that followed was brief and very complete. Daniel looked at Eleanor. She looked back at him. Between them passed the particular communication of two people who have spent 8 days building something together and understand each other's thinking well enough not to need words for it. "No," Daniel said. Helms had expected this. "Mr. Rourke, litigation of this nature can be prolonged and costly. Whatever documentation you believe you have, we have the dual-filed authorization record from the Helena Territorial Archive," Eleanor said. "The one your client signed personally. We have 3 payment records connecting a former employee of this ranch to specific phases of the fraud, supported by that employee's sworn deposition. We have the certified original 1874 survey superseding your client's revised county plat. And we have a signed statement from Caleb Hargrove describing his role in the scheme to introduce an informant into this household." She held Helms's gaze. "We have sent copies of all of this to the Federal Land Office examiner in Helena, who has confirmed receipt and opened a formal inquiry." She paused. "A withdrawal of the civil claim does not close a federal fraud inquiry, Mr. Helms. You know that." The lawyer with the briefcase had stopped looking uncomfortable and started looking alarmed. Helms himself was still composed, but the strain at the edges had become something more structural.
He was a man looking at the distance between where he had been standing and where he could safely stand, and finding it larger than he had planned for. "My client," he began. "Your client put his name on a document he believed had been removed from the record," Eleanor said. "It was not removed. That document, combined with everything else we have, is sufficient for criminal fraud charges at the federal level in addition to the civil matter." She let a beat pass. "If Mr.
Whitmore is interested in the shape of what cooperation with the federal examiner might look like for someone who comes forward voluntarily before charges are filed. That is a conversation for his attorneys and the examiner's office, not for this gate." She looked at Helms directly. "I'd suggest making that call before the end of the week." Helms looked at Daniel for a long moment, and Daniel looked back at him with the still, patient expression of a man who has nothing to prove and nowhere he needs to be. Then Helms touched his hat again, said, "Good day, Mr. Rourke," and turned the buggy around. They watched it go until it was a shape on the northern road, and then a suggestion of dust, and then nothing. Pete Calloway, who had been at the south fence line and had apparently seen the buggy arrive and come back without being asked, appeared at Eleanor's left elbow. "Was that them?" "That was their lawyer," she said. "What'd he want?" "To make a deal." "Did we take it?"
"No," Daniel said. Pete considered this. "Good," he said, for the second time in 2 days, and went back to the fence line. Ruth, who had watched the entire exchange from the porch with the expression of a woman attending a performance she'd expected to enjoy, went inside and began making something that smelled like pie, which was her particular way of marking an occasion. The federal examiner arrived from Helena 12 days later, accompanied by a territorial marshal and an assistant, who spent 3 days in the study with Eleanor, going through every document in the leather case, asking questions that were precise and intelligent, and that she answered with the same precision she had used to build the record in the first place. Daniel sat in on the sessions and said very little, which was exactly right. The examiner needed to see that the case rested on the documents and the expertise of the person who had found them, not on the word of the man whose land was at stake. On the afternoon of the third day, the examiner set down his pen, looked at Eleanor across the desk, and said, "Miss Voss, in 14 years of land fraud examination, I have not seen a more complete evidentiary record assembled in this period of time, and under these circumstances." "The record built itself," Eleanor said. "I only knew where to look." "With respect," he said, "that is the most difficult part." Gerald Whitmore was charged with federal land fraud, conspiracy, and suborning falsification of county records 6 weeks later. Prescott Helms surrendered his law license the following month as part of a negotiated arrangement with the federal examiner's office. Clyde Marsh, the county surveyor, resigned his position and moved to Billings, where his daughter's hardware merchant husband reportedly gave him a job sweeping the warehouse, which was perhaps not precisely the retirement he had planned, but was considerably better than the alternative. The Whitmore and Associates land acquisitions across 3 Montana counties were reviewed by the federal examiner's office, and a substantial portion of them were found to involve the same fraudulent mechanism, which meant that Daniel Rourke's case became the foundation of an inquiry that returned land to 17 other ranch families across Powell and Fergus counties before the following spring. Eleanor learned about that last part from the Helena newspaper, which Miles brought back from one of his supply runs. She read the article at the kitchen table on a December morning, with the first real snow of the season coming down outside the window, and Ruth making coffee at the stove, and Pete Calloway trying to teach the barn cat to sit, which the cat was declining with complete dignity. She set the paper down and sat with it for a moment. 17 families. She hadn't known about the others when she was building the record. She had been focused on this ranch, these documents, this specific fraud.
But the architecture of what Whitmore had built was the same across every county he'd operated in, which meant the record she'd assembled here was a key that opened every other lock he'd constructed. She thought about the 18 months in Cincinnati, about the federal judge in the Southern District of Ohio who had made his career partly on her name appearing in the wrong context at the wrong time. She thought about what it felt like to know the truth of a situation and be unable to make it matter. She thought about feeding Caleb Hargrove's letters into the depot stove and sitting on a bench with 11 cents and the specific pride of a woman who had decided that whatever came next, she would not be broken by what had come before. Daniel came in from the barn, shaking snow from his hat, and poured himself coffee and sat down across from her at the table. He saw the newspaper. He read the headline without picking it up. 17 families, he said. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. Outside, Pete had apparently made progress with the cat, because there was a brief silence, followed by the sound of Pete saying, "There you go," in the satisfied tone of someone who has convinced a skeptical party of something. Daniel's mouth moved in the way it moved when he was amused and choosing not to show all of it. "I want to ask you something," he said. He set down his cup and looked at her with the full directness he used for things that mattered. No preliminary. "And I want you to answer it honestly, not carefully." "I generally answer things honestly," she said. "You answer things precisely. It's not always the same." He held her gaze. "Are you planning to leave in the spring?" She had been thinking about it. Not the way she had thought about leaving Cincinnati. That had been necessity, the desperate arithmetic of a situation that had become untenable. This was different. She had thought about it the way you think about a door that is genuinely open, because someone has left it that way on purpose, and the choice belongs entirely to you. "I had thought about it," she said. "And?" She looked at the newspaper on the table, at the kitchen that had become familiar in the way that only happens when a place has accommodated itself to you and you to it, at the snow coming down outside the window over land that she now knew in the specific way of someone who has read every document that described it, every boundary and survey point and water right, until the land had become a kind of text she understood. She thought about 17 families who were keeping their land this winter, because she had known where to look in a stack of disordered records at 5:30 in the morning 8 weeks ago. She thought about Daniel Rourke, who had offered a woman he didn't know an honest position and an honest wage and a locked cabinet for the documents that mattered, and who had sat in a corner chair in the lamplight without asking for anything and trusted her completely with something he'd spent 15 years building. "I have been thinking," she said, "about whether a property operation of this size, across 4,800 acres, with the additional land the examiner's office has indicated may be returned to you from the Whitmore acquisitions, requires a permanent bookkeeper or merely a periodic one." Daniel looked at her for a moment. "It requires a permanent one. The records alone are a full-time position," she agreed. "And there are the tax filings and the water rights documentation for the creek boundary and the cattle sale contracts, which I've noticed are not being structured in a way that maximizes your position." She paused. "Additionally, the 17 families whose land claims were reviewed on the basis of our record, several of them have asked the Federal Examiner's Office whether the woman who assembled the documentation might be available for consultation on their own records, which are in various states of disorder for the same reasons ours were." "Ours," Daniel said. Not a correction, an observation, carefully neutral, about the word she had used. "The ranches," she said, and then stopped, because that was the careful version, and he had specifically asked her not to give him that. She looked at him directly. "I came here with 11 cents and nowhere to go," she said. "I came to leave everything behind and start somewhere nobody knew the story. What I didn't expect." She stopped again, not from avoidance, but because she was working out how to say the true thing in a way that was accurate rather than dramatic. "What I didn't expect was to find that the thing I've been running from, was also the thing that was needed here. That the skills I had spent 18 months wishing I didn't have because of what they cost me were exactly the right instrument for exactly this situation. She held his gaze. I feel useful here in a way I have not felt in a long time. And I feel... A pause. I feel settled, which is not a word I have been able to use honestly for several years. Daniel is quiet for a moment. The snow came down outside. The coffee cooled between them. Pete Calloway could be heard in the yard, talking to the cat again, apparently embarked on a continuing negotiation. There is a territorial land examiner's office opening in Billings next year, Daniel said. They'll need people who can read survey records and identify fraud. It would be regular work, respected position, good wage. He held her gaze. You could apply for it. You have more qualifications than anyone they're likely to consider. She understood what he was doing, laying out the honest map of her options, the full set of them, without steering. A man who had spent 8 years in an agency that required people to make choices without full information had learned to give people full information when he could. I know, she said. But the Billings office won't have 17 families who need their records read by someone who already understands the specific mechanism that was used against them. She paused. And it won't have this kitchen, or Ruth, or Pete trying to educate that cat. She looked at him steadily. Or you. The word landed between them clean and simple, without apology or performance. Daniel looked at her with the expression she had come to know best on him. The one that was not reserved, exactly, but contained. A man who felt things fully and expressed them carefully. Who had learned that precision mattered in what you said because it mattered in what you meant. I should tell you something, he said, and I want you to hear it as what it is, not as a complication of your employment. Go ahead. I have not... He stopped, started again. There was a woman in St. Louis during the Pinkerton years. We were suited in some ways, not in the ways that matter for a life. She wanted the city, and I couldn't breathe in it. When I left for Montana, I understood that I was probably leaving the possibility of that kind of thing behind. That the life I was choosing, and the life a particular kind of woman would want, were not the same life. He looked at his hands, then back at her. And then you sat down at that gate and told Hargrove that you had built a complete evidentiary record, and watched his face understand what that meant, and I thought... He stopped again. I thought that I have never in my life seen anything as clear and exact and quietly formidable as the way you work. And that the life I built here and the life you are is not a mismatch. It is the only match I have ever been able to imagine for this land and this work, and whatever I have left to build. Eleanor sat with that for a moment. She turned it over the way she turned over a document she needed to understand fully, not rushing to the conclusion, but reading every word in order, making sure she had it right. That is a very precise declaration, she said finally. I thought you'd appreciate precision. I do. She looked at him. I am not easy to work with. I am thorough to the point of inconvenience, and I will reorganize any system I find disordered, regardless of how long it has been operating that way. And I have a pronounced intolerance for numbers that don't balance. She paused. I am also, apparently, useful in the kind of crisis that involves someone trying to steal 4,800 acres from under a person. I noticed, he said. Then you know what you're asking for. I know exactly what I'm asking for. He met her eyes. Do you want to stay, Eleanor? Not as the bookkeeper. Not as the person who assembled the evidentiary record. As the person who sits across this table and calls this kitchen hers, and builds whatever comes next, alongside someone who is paying enough attention to know the difference between what you say and what you mean. He held her gaze,
steady and unhurried, the way he held everything. Stay, not from necessity, from choice. Outside, the snow had softened to something quieter, and the Montana winter light was the particular blue-white that came on clear December afternoons when the sky was clean all the way to the horizon. Ruth was doing something purposeful in the kitchen that involved the good cast-iron pan. Pete's voice had gone quiet, which probably meant the cat had finally conceded something. Eleanor thought about a depot stove and 11 cents, and a woman who had fed her own last hope into the fire, and stood straight-backed while it burned, because her mother had told her that pride cost nothing and could purchase dignity in the hardest moments. She thought about what it meant to be useful in a way that was entirely your own, not borrowed competence, not proximity to someone else's work, but your specific skills deployed at the exact point where they mattered most. And the record you built with them meaning something real and lasting in the lives of 17 families who would keep their land through the winter because of it. She thought about Daniel Rourke, who had looked at a woman sitting alone at a depot gate and seen a situation rather than a charity case, who had offered honest work and honest terms and a locked cabinet for the documents that mattered, and who had told her the true thing at every point where it would have been easier not to, and whose hands she had watched turn a fraudulent audit into a federal case with the same steady, unhurried attention he gave to horses and fence lines and the question of whether a young man's deposition would hold under examination. She looked at him across the kitchen table, in the ranch that had become hers by the slow accumulation of 8 days and 17 families and one December morning. And she said the true thing, not the careful version, the honest one. "I already have," she said. And in the territory of Montana, in the winter of 1882, in a kitchen that smelled like Ruth's coffee and the first good snow of the season, that was how Eleanor Voss, who had arrived with 11 cents, a burned letter, and the specific pride of a woman who refused to be finished, chose the life that had been waiting for someone precise enough to build it, and claimed it with both hands, and did not let go.